had a procurement function with the power, in other words, this is all about how the procurement function is incentivized. And there needs to be what you might call a facility for measuring the upside benefit of spending more alongside the benefit of spending less. And when it's done well, and if it were incentivized well, it could be a truly magical influence on business.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. And for today's episode, we begin an exploration into the subject of behavioral economics. This is a subject that I feel is increasingly important to understand given its impact on organizational management, on marketing, and in how commercial discussions are actually designed. It's a topic that we haven't covered a lot on the show so far, but one that I want to really bring into a lot more focus. And so when considering who could we talk to on this topic, we reached out to Rory Sutherland. Rory is Vice Chair of Ogilvy, the global advertising, marketing and public relations agency, and the founder of Ogilvy Change, which is a dedicated behavioral interventions agency within the Ogilvy Group. Now, Rory helped start us on our journey. He's also a leading voice in the field. He's given a number of TED Talks and teaches a best-selling online course on this subject. As you'll hear from the conversation itself, Rory is definitely provocative and full of ideas on commentary. And while we started out looking for answers to specific procurement-related questions, it became clear from the outset there was greater value in actually establishing a foundation for a deeper, longer-term conversation, which Rory is eager to participate, both formally with us and informally through the community, specifically through Twitter, which he shares details of later in the show. So the conversation with Rory was wide-ranging and it was pretty extended. I think our discussion clocked in at almost 2 hours. I've edited it slightly just to highlight certain aspects of what we covered. And while I considered separating it into a couple of different podcasts, I ultimately felt that that would take away from the essence of the conversation. That being said, you might want to listen in a couple of sittings unless you have 2 hours to spare. So let's jump straight into our discussion. I start by asking Rory for his definition of behavioral economics.
I suppose, I mean, there's a proper official definition of behavioral economics, and there's my own one. In a sense, I mean, behavioral science and behavioral economics has been particularly important because economics, in a sense, was a little bit of a cheat in that it was allowed to claim that so perfect were its axioms and theories that when people instinctively deviated from, the standard optimal behavior as defined by economists were allowed to describe that behavior as irrational. Now, no other science is allowed that luxury. As a physicist, if you have a theory and your basic experiments all fail, you aren't allowed to blame the failure of your experiment on pervy electrons or, deviant gravitational behavior. You can't actually blame matter for failing to live up to your theory. But in economics, you kind of could. Now, interestingly, I think quite a lot of behavioral economists see the role of nudge theory, the role of behavioral economics as a means to get people to behave more closely in alignment with what economists think they should be doing. Mm-hmm. I have an equally strong interest not only in behavioral economics but also in evolutionary psychology, and I have a very different take. It's simply to say that when our natural instinctive behavior, tipping, for example, differs from that which Homo economicus would be supposed to consider economically optimal. My argument is that this doesn't necessarily mean the human is wrong and the economist is right. It's to ask the question, why is there that disparity? And is there a perfectly good reason, if you look at a wider context than economists do, is there a deeper reason to explain this behavior, which may be an evolutionary reason, which is now redundant in the modern world? That's always possible. Equally, as I said, evolution, what it lacks in intellect, it makes up for in long experience. Evolution may actually be right, and the economist may be wrong. And I think, there are huge, if you think about it, the assumptions of economics partly are predicated on perfect information and perfect trust. Patently, the evolved human brain has evolved to optimize us for an environment where we don't have perfect information. In fact, people may well be lying to us. And we certainly don't have perfect trust. And to assume away things such as uncertainty and lack of information or possible untrustworthiness, to assume those away in a model is crazy.
Right.
And so in many, many cases, what we're doing as instinctive human beings may be a perfectly rational response to living in a world where you can't be absolutely sure what the other person will do. The other thing is that once you understand that all human decision-making, and there's a good book by Annie Duke, the former professional poker player, on this, which is called, it encourages you to see life decisions as bets. And she regards poker as a much better analogy for real life than chess. Chess is a case where you do have all the information, you can see your partner's position, etc. In poker, there will always be an element of hidden information which is willfully mistransmitted, for example, in order to deceive. And the conditions for decision-making in poker are different from the decisions for behavior in chess. And so I'll give you a very simple example of this, okay? The business when you invest in something, of taking the people out to dinner, right, or playing golf with them, something that procurement people probably really, really hate, I bet everyone in procurement secretly goes has a kind of, they sick up a little bit in their mouth when they see that there's a golf day going on, okay? Right? Because it's exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't be happening, right, which is people getting matey with their suppliers. It's the kind of thing you really, really hate. Actually, I can see lots and lots of rational reasons for this, which is it's much, much more emotionally painful to cheat someone who's your mate. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, I have clients who are also my mates. Yeah. I shouldn't say this, but I kind of make 50% more discretionary effort for those people. Yeah. And my reluctance to underserve them or to deceive them would be absolutely visceral. There's a huge difference in banking between ripping off somebody who you've just had dinner with and ripping off someone who you know as account number 407-96243. Yeah. So quite a lot of human behavior, which seems to be absolute anathema to the procurement mind, in an evolutionary context, makes a lot of sense. I'll give you another example. I always use the same local taxi firm. And my reasoning for doing this, I'm sure I could save money in the short term by putting out every single journey to open bids or stuff. I'm sure there's someone in Silicon Valley who's coming up with exactly this suggestion, by the way. Okay, but I want my taxi firm to see me as a loyal source of future revenue, because one day I know I'm going to have to ask them for a favor.
Yeah.
And in the same way, I much prefer flying with British Airways because I know that British Airways knows I fly with them quite a lot.
Right. Yeah.
With Lufthansa, if anything goes wrong, I'm effectively a tourist. Okay. With British Airways, they can look at my past value, extrapolate future value, and the likelihood they're going to make a discretionary effort to sort me out in some unspecified way. I'm stuck in Stockholm, the snow's coming down, there's one seat left on the last plane. The likelihood they're going to pull, So there's some really interesting sort of game theoretic aspects to all this, which mean that decision-making under uncertainty the rules for decision-making under uncertainty are fundamentally different to the rules for decision-making in chess, where you have all the information and the moves are constrained. Okay? It's worth remembering, by the way, the rules of chess are totally constant. Now, the rules for real life aren't like that at all. You know, a game of chess where actually the available moves to a bishop might change in 5 minutes. Okay, that would change the game of chess quite. Suddenly, bishops are allowed to move in a straight line. That would change the game of chess quite significantly. In real life, it's kind of like that. The other thing to remember is that when you're making decisions probabilistically, and this is really important, you have to consider more than one factor. You have to consider the average outcome, the expected outcome, but you also have to consider the variance of outcome. Yeah. So something that's very good on average, but might be terrible, okay, 1% of the time, okay, even though if you look at it probabilistically, very simply, it's the best option, the best price to value thing. If you're buying a television, okay, and one television is 20% cheaper, it has the same functionality as the other television, but there's a 3% chance you think it might be awful, okay, and the other television, there's only a 0.1% chance it's going to be awful, but you're paying quite a lot extra to remove that 3%.
Yeah.
Okay, that 3%. Now, that might not be irrational. Okay, now you're hating this, I know. Okay?
No, it's a form of risk management, really, isn't it?
So, because what's so interesting is that behaviors you adopt in the guise of variance reduction, in other words, it's not perfect, but it's always going to be pretty good, what I call the McDonald's solution. You know, McDonald's isn't the best restaurant in the world because it's the best food in the world. In a way, it's the best restaurant in the world because it's really good at not being terrible.
Yep,
okay?
And you know what you're going to get.
You know what you're going to get, you know the price, you're not going to get ripped off, and you're not going to get ill. Yep. That's the real thing. I get cross that there isn't a McDonald's at Heathrow Terminal 5, because my argument is, if I'm going to spend the next 9 hours on a plane, the most important criterion for a meal is it isn't going to make me ill.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, you know, there are a load of other criteria, but actually, I've had food poisoning at 36,000 feet. I don't want that ever to happen again.
Right.
Okay? Now, when you look at variance reduction, quite a lot of, and I'll explain a bit more the importance of variance reduction as distinct from expectation optimization going forward. I'll explain the distinction. But strategies for variance reduction, which is rational, I avoid the chance of terrible. The people in charge of KFC's chicken distribution in the UK probably could have given a bit more consideration to this. Okay. You know, cheaper. Yeah, we had one central hub for distribution. New thing, absolutely brilliant. What happens if the hub goes wrong? That was what the competitive bidder said.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is the point, which is that a multi-hub solution for distribution of fresh food is always going to be more expensive than a single hub thing, but you're gaining in lower variance, which is that a single hub can be a systemic disaster. So this trade-off between efficiency and fragility is a really interesting point. Okay, you all know this. I don't want to be patronizing, but what's so interesting is that variance reduction strategies can be apparently totally irrational. If you only look at a narrow short-term context, it looks irrational. So the classic sort of, I would argue as an advertising guy that brand preference is mostly an instinctive human variance reduction strategy. Now, what this does is it taps into a conversation which David Ogilvy had in the 1960s in Chicago with a very, very brilliant man who's still alive, a very brilliant copywriter who founded Ogilvy in Chicago. And what this man said to him, which fascinates me, he said to David Ogilvy, and I think Ogilvy agreed with him, I don't think people buy brand B rather than brand A because they think it's better. I think they buy brand B because they're more certain that it's good.
Yeah.
And what you're doing when you pay $100 extra for a Samsung television, as opposed to a television with some weird Chinese word on it, even though ostensibly these two TVs are the same, is the Samsung is more certain to be good.
Yeah.
And you could argue that the mechanism that makes the Samsung more certain to be good is actually that Samsung's brand value is a reputational fragility which keeps them honest. Which is that a brand like Samsung has much more to lose from selling a bad television than a brand you've never heard of.
So one of Rory's favourite stalking horses is the drive towards conformity in business. And he doesn't like it. Actually, as we discover, he's quite averse to it. And this is an interesting debate to me, given our predisposition as procurement professionals to try and commoditize as many of the products and services that we buy in an effort to then use leverage to negotiate what we believe is a more favorable deal, by creating competition or the perception of competition in the marketplace. But the reality is, in many cases, we're also significantly reducing the opportunity for value creation with a partner by taking that approach. A lot of what we buy is so specification driven, and it's all built on the back end that you have to be able to do an apples to apples comparison. And if you can't do what we would deem as an apples to apples comparison, then it throws out the system.
Now, this is very interesting because it's actually a philosophical question. I wrote a piece in The Spectator once, which is entitled, if you want greater diversity, you have to stop trying to be fair. Not being fair sounds like an outrageous thing, but if you think about it, if you choose, for example, if you want fair recruitment or you want fair admission to universities, okay, the only way you can make it fair is by applying exactly the same criteria to everybody. And when you apply the same criteria to everybody, you end up with spectacular uniformity.
Yeah.
And the trade-off between what you might call fairness or ease of comparison and diversity of solution, seems to be one where we regard it as perfectly acceptable not to, in other words, to impose. I mean, a classic example of this would be in the inverted commas fair approach to recruitment, which is that graduate recruits have to have a 2-1, an upper second or above. Now, before you can even get an interview, before you can even get considered, I said, well, look, if 1 or 2 people do that, that's kind of okay because, if Goldman Sachs do it, what the hell,
right.
They've got to cut down their applications.
Yeah.
What happens when everybody does it? I met someone who'd got a 2-2 in maths from Cambridge and they couldn't get a job interview. And my other consideration is, I said, look, there are always what you might call wider considerations. If someone came to me with a lower second or a third, but they'd been kind of UK under-22 backgammon champion, right? Just to give a sort of totally perverse thing, I kind of want to see them, okay? Because if you're remarkable in some unspecified new dimension, I'm still interested. And so the urge to be fair actually ends up, when applied at scale and repeatedly, it actually ends up making decision-making worse rather than better. When you make the criteria the same for everybody, one, it creates kind of hyper-competition, which I think can be distorting. That's one thing. It can hugely distort markets, for example. Imagine if, for example, we all bought cars as consumers on a kind of formula, which was, you took acceleration, you took, fuel economy, and about 4 other, numerical metrics. And we all basically bought cars on a kind of formula like that. What would actually happen is car manufacturers would eventually end up gaming the system.
Rory made an interesting point on the impact of commoditization within a particular market. And in driving that, that commoditization, do we as buyers actually stifle innovation? So put another way, are those who do not approach a market as a commodity benefiting more from the innovation capacity of their suppliers? And so we discussed the topic of value creation innovation in a little bit more detail. And one of the challenges that Rory sees, which is due to the tendency that we have towards designing outcomes that actually minimize the potential for blame. If you're working for the brand that you've never heard of, and the context for my kind of follow-up on this is, as procurement folks, we're really in the business of change. We're in the business of helping our organizations look at different approaches, different suppliers, even like different scopes of what they thought they wanted and ways they thought they wanted to solve a challenge, and help them seeing that there's a different way, and that way may be more effective, however we choose to determine what effective means. And so a lot of that involves selling to our organization the value or the benefits of going with the unknown name. So if you're in working for this unknown name and you're going against a Samsung, how do you recommend that they approach positioning themselves in a way that creates more value in the mind of the buyer over them going with what may have been the safe choice before?
It's really difficult because I have to admit that in business decision making, there are very, very strong psychological biases towards blame avoidance. Mm-hmm. And of course, the most famous business-to-business advertising slogan of all time, no one ever got fired for buying IBM.
Right.
Okay. So there's a very interesting thing which happens, and I'm sympathetic with you guys on this one, okay, which is it's very, very difficult for someone to make an eccentric decision in business because the degree of blame that in the event that your decision goes wrong, it's a bit like that famous Super Bowl play, which was the Seahawks against the Patriots, okay, right? Actually, Annie Duke, who's a poker player, says that statistically, probabilistically, that was a good decision. The problem was that because it went wrong, and she said the odds of it going wrong were only about 3 or 4%, I think. Because it went wrong, it's always viewed as a terrible decision, and the man's viewed as an idiot for making it. Yeah. Bear in mind, I'm a Brit, so don't ask me detailed questions about the nature of the play.
I'm with you.
I will talk rubbish, okay? Yeah. But what's interesting is that what biases business decision-making is often not, is this the best decision, but what are the reputational consequences if this decision goes wrong? Mm-hmm. Now, we have a client in British Airways, and one of the things that baffles us is there's a very, very good service that runs from London City Airport to JFK. Yeah. Now, London City Airport's closer to central London, much closer to the banking quarter than Heathrow is. It's one plane, I think it's a 757. It's business class only. It's really, really difficult to get people to fly from a different airport other than Heathrow. And this is nothing to do with, I think, end consumer preference. What it is that if you're a PA, if you're an intermediary, and this is effectively the agency problem, if you're the PA or you're the travel agent, you know that if you book someone on a flight, on British Airways flight from Heathrow to JFK, okay, if anything goes wrong, they'll blame British Airways because you haven't really made a decision. You've just gone with the default, okay? The second you do something slightly imaginative, now that might be Heathrow to Newark, for example, or London City to JFK, or Gatwick to JFK. That might be better for the passenger. The passenger may live 10 minutes from Gatwick and an hour from Heathrow, for example. It might be better for the person, but if anything goes wrong, they'll now blame you. And so the asymmetry of blame is I always say mischievously, that's why there are only 4 big accounting firms. Because if you appoint one of the big 4, if anything goes wrong, everybody blames Pricewaterhouse. If you appoint a small boutique firm that nobody's ever heard of, okay, if anything goes wrong, they'll blame you.
Yeah.
So procurement has a really, really valuable function in overcoming what you might call reputational insurance in business decisions. There's another sporting analogy, by the way, there, which is, so, in the statistically, that Seattle Seahawks guy made the right decision, okay? As a business person, all the instinct is to make the decision where if it goes wrong, I will suffer the least reputational consequences. Mm-hmm. So a very simple thing, and this is a total oversimplification, but it's still useful, is in consumer behavior, the dominant driving force is regret minimization. I don't want to do anything I'll end up regretting. Okay? In business decision making, it's blame minimization. And all sorts of things. That's why there are so many meetings, by the way, which is the purpose of a meeting is essentially if you make something a collective decision, okay, and take collective responsibility, then since it's impossible to fire everybody who was in the room at the time, okay, then essentially you generated in the form of personal insurance. There's a wonderful story about Martin Sorrell once, where we lost a very large bit of business about 12 years ago. And Martin rang up the person in charge of the business and said, well, whose fault is this? And he replied, well, as a group, we're taking collective responsibility. To which Martin replied, oh, good, so I can fire lots of people. The point here is that, there's a wonderful example in sport where when you take a penalty kick, and these can be decisive in deciding something like a World Cup semi-final or a World Cup final. Yeah. Actually, not for everybody, but for some people, the best strategy is actually to rally the ball straight down the middle and rely on the goalkeeper diving left or right. Yeah. Okay. Now, adopting that approach, assuming everybody doesn't do it, adopting that approach means you're most likely to score, statistically. The reason very few players do it is because you look much stupider if you lose, if you fail.
That's true, yeah. Yeah.
And so there are an awful lot of business decisions which are really, actually an awful lot, by the way, of, one thing that worries me about modern business, it's very hard to tell the difference between what is rigor and what is arse covering. And an enormous amount of business activity, which is performed under the guise of rigor, of decision-making rigor, we must have all the information, is really arse covering in disguise. I would say about 50% of market research is performed. The decision's already been taken, but you're essentially, buying in opinions as a form of personal reputational insurance and career insurance. I'd also take a more extreme view, by the way, which is to say that reason. Now, I know this is a weird view to say the Enlightenment has gone too far. But I think the use of the logic and reason is overused in business because essentially, what is the best decision to take in business? Is it the one which is the best decision, or is it the one which is the easiest to defend? Now, that sounds crazy because we tend to conflate the two. But actually, in many cases, the best decision is something very, very weird, okay, and slightly silly. I have a view that actually most of the problems in business that can be solved by the naked application of reason have already been solved. And so the problems that remain in business are problems which in some way or other are kind of logic proof. That actually the way to solve them is maybe oblique or it's possibly too trivial for the dignity of people who've been asked to solve it. I work in an ad agency, so I've given up trying to maintain the pretense that life makes sense.
Right.
And so we ran a direct mail campaign a few years ago, and we've been running a very similar campaign every year for the previous 2 or 3 years. This year, it was spectacularly successful. And they went around saying, can anybody explain why it's sort of twice as successful this year compared to the previous year? And people tried to intellectualize it, but actually those explanations weren't very good. And they finally came to me and I said, look, no one else is going to tell you this, but I've worked in advertising for 30 years, and I have so little faith in, the ability for what you might call rational economic explanation to actually predict human behavior. Let me tell you what the real reason is. I said, no one else will, because it's undignified, it's trivial, it's kind of bonkers. But the real reason is the envelope is covered with really cute pictures of rabbits. If you put a nice animal on something, it just gains 3 times more attention. I hate to say this, it's one of the few really robust findings in advertising, that if you put an animal in the thing, Aflac, for example, compare the meerkat in the UK, put an animal in the thing, it'll probably work better.
We need to start using a puppy as the logo for procurement. Yeah. Everybody will suddenly love it.
For procurement, absolutely.
When we were kind of in communication before the podcast, you mentioned that you're really fascinated with the idea of behavioral economics as it actually applies to the procurement conversation. And I wondered, what is it that fascinates you about procurement specifically and behavioral economics?
Well, I think one of the things is this whole cost-value debate. One of the things is this whole problem that business, since the invention of the spreadsheet, has started overweighting those things which happen to be numerically expressible and comparable, and underweighting the importance of things which may be simply hard to define. And I also think that there's a real issue in terms of procurement having what you might call a one-way incentive scheme. If you cut the cost of something, you get bonused. If you actually do something that's more expensive but brilliant, what's the reward mechanism for that? So one interesting thing I would always argue, in fact, is that one thing that terrifies me in terms of what's the difference. There's a great book, by the way, I'll also recommend called The Elephant in the Mind, which has just come out, jointly written by Robin Hanson and Kevin Simler in the US. And that points out some really quite awkward but undoubtedly true facts about how evolutionary psychology differs and means that what we value is not the same as what a logical economist would think is valuable. So in many cases, in our consumption of healthcare, the feeling that the provider cares is actually much more important to us emotionally than the statistical outcome of the operation. Okay? Now, this is kind of an awkward fact, because I mean, it's widely known, by the way, that the likelihood of anybody to sue their doctor is not determined really very much by the egregiousness of the medical mistake that the doctor made. It's whether or not you like the guy.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, there is.
You want to get one back on them, or you?
Not only did he botch my operation, but the guy was rude to me.
Right.
And. Whereas actually someone with a great bedside manner, you probably forgive them all that kind of medical,
you put it down to numbers
negligence.
and that sometimes happens, and he did his best work, and I was unfortunate versus...
Actually, what we enjoy about something... I'll tell you a lovely story about this, which is that there is somewhere in the human brain an appreciation of discretionary expense, okay? So that what you really love about your BMW or your Jaguar or whatever is to some extent those things which aren't really necessary. Piping on leather seats is the kind of slightly bonkers thing, that just for whatever reason. Now, there is, if you go into deep evolutionary psychology, there is a reason for all this, which is that the best proxy for medical care, was probably, does this person seem to care about me? We use these proxy measures all the time. To some extent, behaviors that defy economic rationality have a disproportionate meaning. Because anything that's rational doesn't convey meaning. The things that convey meaning are the things you do which don't make sense. This is rather like aposematic signaling in nature, that poisonous animals actually are very brightly colored. Now, you'd think it would make sense for them to be camouflaged. What they do is they adopt a very brightly colored pattern, like ladybirds, to say, there must be a good reason to eat me, because otherwise I couldn't get away with this bonkers coloration. A ladybird spends most of its time on a leaf. You'd think that green would be a good fashion choice. But instead, actually, to signal the fact that they taste disgusting, they're deliberately black and red. And quite often, meaning is conveyed by doing something which only makes sense in the light of something else. Okay? Now, if you go to Five Guys, I don't know if the procurement guy from Five Guys is listening, but he's probably driven insane by the fact that every time you go to Five Guys, they give you an extra scoop of fries at the bottom of the bag for free. Okay? Mm-hmm. There's probably a procurement guy at Nestle who's driven insane by the fact that San Pellegrino cans have a little foil lid on top. Okay? And this guy is going crazy, going, we could reduce our unit cost by 0.1 cents if we didn't have this foil lid, The only thing is, it's the very gratuitousness of those things which makes them emotionally potent. And if you think about the Five Guys thing, an act of generosity, an act of discretionary generosity has a kind of meaning, because it says, what I've proved to you with these extra fries or with this little foil lid is I'm not in the business of the narrow, one-off, untrustworthy transaction. if you think about the historical, the standard model for the dishonest business is the tourist restaurant, because everybody goes there once. TripAdvisor's changed that, I grant that. But, there is a business.
Now it's the gas station by the airport, by the rental counter.
You've got it exactly. Right next to the car rental counter. Yep. Exactly. That's the kind of business which essentially, repeat. And I suppose there will be repeat custom problems with regular renters, but you're absolutely right. There are certain businesses where it pays to be a crook. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, a reliable sign of a business which is honest, and this applies in plants as well, is something that invests in something which suggests that it's playing the repeat game rather than the one-off game. So giving you extra fries only makes sense in the light of a business which is expecting people to come back. And so there are certain, what you might call non-conditional, gratuitous acts of generosity which convey quite a lot of meaning. And I've always said that in procurement, what we've got to do, because it always used to upset me that when there was a new product being developed or there was a new advertising campaign being developed, that slightly gratuitous thing was the first to be killed. But it was the very fact that it was gratuitous that gave it real signaling power. A lovely story from healthcare, okay? So someone comes up to me and says, I had my first ever private operation as distinct from an NHS operation the other day. And she said, I thought it was marvellous. And do you know why? I said, I don't know. Was it the quality of the operation? She said, no idea about that. I was unconscious. She said. No, she said, what really mattered to me was I was in a private hospital, and after I came round from the operation, they brought me a glass of water. And they put a doily underneath, okay? Right. Now, that is, in one sense, completely peripheral to the business of medicine. Medicine should all be about, measuring outcomes, blah, 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 blah. But to the emotional person, and incidentally to the placebo effect, which isn't totally irrelevant, the doily might be surprisingly potent, precisely because it isn't necessary. And there's something there where one of the things is, the first budget to be cut, I'm sure, if the NHS is short of money, is the doily budget. Right. It's the budget for these things, rather as actually, something's been destroyed by procurement people in rail travel, in that it's all about capacity, speed, duration. And as a result, the seats have become like bloody ironing boards, because if you have a really uncomfortable seat, you can fit 4 more seats per carriage, and that does a wonderful job of your capacity statistics. But for, all but 4 of the 80 passengers in the carriage, it makes their journey it makes the whole train experience feel kind of austere. There's something about it, things that are really, really efficient in a weird kind of way, sometimes, not always, but sometimes we don't actually like them very much. And the idea of economists that the whole role of business is a quest for kind of the supply of narrowly defined things at as low a cost as possible is philosophically quite limiting, because what you're actually supplying as a business, I mean, to what extent is BMW as a brand about a form of transportation? This is what I mean about the very dangerous question of defining what it is you do narrowly for the purposes of clarity. So, the standard Silicon Valley approach is, okay, you have a hotel with a doorman. We define the role of the doorman as opening the door. We replace the doorman with an infrared sensor and a set of automatic doors. Here is technology to the rescue at a cost saving of X. And what that all ignores is the fact that the actual role of a hotel doorman is only very peripheral, just as a BMW is only peripherally about transportation. The role of a hotel doorman is only incidentally about door opening. It's actually recognition, it's security, it's status signaling by the hotel, it's taxi hailing, it's all those other things. And I think there's a huge danger in that when we actually answer questions like what is something, I mean, this goes to the heart of market research. Consumers, when you ask them what they want from something and why they buy something, will not come up with an honest reason. They come up with a post-rationalization. And if you take that post-rationalization literally, you will end up providing completely the wrong thing.
As procurement folks, we're often buying to predetermined scopes or specifications. You know, they're built by somebody has decided that they want the seats in a train to feel like an ironing board because they know that the input costs of that are going to be less than making it feel like, you know, the seat in a BMW. I wonder, and I'm kind of curious, your approach to figuring out what's the outcome we're trying to drive in a lot of these purchases that people are making or organizations are making, because we often are trying to solve for something that may not be the outcome that the business really wants. You know, we're looking at it and saying, hey, we're going to solve for the fact that we want a cheaper seat versus what we want to do is we want to help get more bums on seats.
Well, this is where business gets really, really messy because, of course, one of my great defenses of free market capitalism is that it's the only free market consumer capitalism, for all its faults. And of course, it's massively, the idea that this is efficient is a total lie. It's massively inefficient. And in many ways, Marxist ideas, Marxism is much better at, you know, providing a very narrow range of goods efficiently. Where it falls down is innovation, and it falls down particularly because Marxism can only provide the things that people say they want. And the reason you need competitive capitalism is, tragically, we don't know what we want or why we want it. We don't even know why we buy the things we buy, actually. You know, the level of self-deception. We don't have introspective access to our real motivations. And there's a whole evolutionary area of this driven by a man called Robert Trivers, who believes that it's not in our evolutionary interests to actually attach accurate reasoning to our motivation. So there's a reason why so much of our behavior is actually really opaque to introspection. And so to some extent, the great facility of capitalism is what I call Red Bull. It's discovering a human need for things which no rational person would ever say they want to. Denim. Okay, you know, I have no idea why denim is a popular fabric for trousers. I'm genuinely, you know, there is no objective measure on which you can say, compared to, say, synthetics, that denim is somehow a fantastic fabric. I mean, it seems to be flawed in all manner of ways. Red Bull, you know, you never have said what we really need is an overpriced drink in a tiny can that tastes disgusting, you know. And, you know, the great thing about capitalism is it does discover needs to which we ourselves have no real access. And Nassim Taleb actually quotes me in his recent book, Skin in the Game, which is a very interesting book for procurement people to read, by the way, in which I say things like, actually, the reason we buy things might be surprisingly weird. You know, the great value of having a swimming pool isn't that you swim in it, it's that you can walk around your garden in a bathing costume without feeling like an idiot. No. Yeah. I had a friend who explained what he thought was the deep emotional reason why people bought massive luxury yachts, which is you can invite all your friends on board and then treat them like Captain Bligh. You see, even if you have the most expensive villa in the world, people will turn up in a hire car, and on Wednesday your friends will say, well, actually, we're thinking of going into Siena tomorrow, so we thought it might be quite nice to have lunch there. And you can't really stop them. You can't have armed guards preventing your friends from leaving. If you're on a yacht, your friends can be having a lovely time sitting on the harbour side drinking coffee, and you simply send over the tender and say, we're weighing anchor in 15 minutes, you need to be on the boat now, and they're powerless to resist. So to anybody who's obsessed with effectively, you know, exhibiting extraordinary power and dominance, a yacht offers, it's, you know, as a form of transportation, it's patently hopeless. But so many of the things I think we buy and so many of the things that are consumed for reasons which are completely oblique and peripheral to what you might state as your rational justification for that thing. That defining what a product is for is hugely, hugely difficult. I mean, another thing, by the way, in which I think you have to be really careful is procurement people love commodities, don't you? Because you can then compare like with like. And you love to commodify. I hate commodities. I despise them, okay? I buy branded salt. Okay, I know it's sodium chloride, but I still buy branded salt.
Yeah. Well, by commoditizing, we're attempting to take away
you're
the
destroying value.
And we're trying to buy our input cost.
Because the value of my Welsh Anglesey sea salt doesn't really lie in sodium chloride. It lies in the associations I have when I sprinkle it on. I'm Welsh myself. I quite like having salt, you know. I'm not like a salt racist or anything, but I like the idea that salt comes from my original homeland, right? Okay. You know, there's a whole host of value there which is destroyed. The other thing that's destroyed when you commoditize things, of course, is producer trust. Now, I don't think it's very likely if I buy cheap commoditized salt that it's going to be poisoned or cut with some other cheaper substance. But let's remember the horse meat crisis, okay? If you actually have branded beef and it comes from a beef farm, right? That guy is going to hate the idea of doctoring his beef, because if he's found out, the reputational consequences go back to him. Skin in the game again, to use Nassim's thing. The second you have a load of... Now, economists become practically tumescent of this because it's so wonderfully efficient. The second you have a load of beef farmers producing beef at as low a price as possible, that's certified beef, and they all put it into a great big beef sack, where it's then traded as a commodity, okay, the reputational feedback loop is now broken, and every single beef supplier now has an incentive to chuck a bit of horse in with their beef. Okay? Now, interestingly, oil is traded as a commodity. Okay? I would pay a premium for ethical oil. In other words, oil that's produced by countries which aren't totally hideous kind of medieval theocracies, right? I can't do that because so my consumer power is diminished. I would get a lovely warm glow if I could buy lovely Canadian oil or something, you know, artisan oil, indeed, put in my car, you know, produced by nice, you know, check-shirted Canadians in a kind of liberal democracy. I'd pay a premium for that every time. I can't do it because of this bastard commodification. Now, commoditization, right, okay, it really stinks, okay? I mean this. I won't go into this, a bit of economic research about the Marseille fish market, which is why people resisted. This is wonderful research by an economist, Alain, I've forgotten his surname, but we can Google it later.
Yeah, I'll look it up. I'll put it in the show notes.
He's at the university, I think he's at the University of Toulouse, somewhere like that. Mm-hmm. Now, what they wanted to do was basically have the fish come in, it would be auctioned as cod or brill or hake, and then people would buy at auction. And people said, no, we want intermediaries. We like the intermediaries because with the intermediary, there's a whole bunch of nuanced trade. But secondly, of course, the intermediary guarantees product quality far better because cod is not a commodity, okay? There's the better stuff and there's the worse stuff. And the guy who's buying for a Michelin-starred restaurant does not want to buy commodified cod. He wants to deal with a trader who goes, actually, I've got a bit of this stuff that came off the first boat and I've kept it back for you because you're one of my loyal customers. That's how we've evolved to trade and attempts to make it efficient. Now, I'll give you a perfect example of this, which I think economists should study. Do you remember about 3 Christmases ago, there was that thing called the hoverboard or the Ouija board, which was like a crap Segway without a stick?
It was the best thing since sliced bread, apparently, at the time.
And the interesting thing is, now I think it was potentially an interesting idea. It went nowhere. Right. Now, interestingly, had there been a Panasonic Ouija board or a Samsung hoverboard, I would have bought one. Even if it had cost $100 more, I would have bought one in an instant. Here's what happens when you don't have brands and you commoditize things, okay? So, a whole bunch of Chinese manufacturers in Shenzhen are making these things, and they're all slightly different, okay? The manufacturers are unknown, so there's no point in them attaching a name to them, clearly, because they have no reputational skin in the game because they're totally obscure. Most of the devices were actually branded by importers. And they all varied. There were ones with big wheels, wheels with lights on, smaller wheels, but none of us could make sense of the category. Okay? So first of all, we couldn't use the brand as a useful heuristic in deciding which was the most reliable one to buy. So that's problem number one. I couldn't decide which one to buy, and I couldn't make sense of the category. Secondly, because nobody had there was no famous reputation attached, I couldn't confidently say, here is someone with reputational, a reputational commitment device, and I know that someone selling under this name is basically incentivized not to cheat. But the third thing happened, and this is a really interesting one, okay? There was no incentive for those manufacturers to innovate and make a better hoverboard because the gains wouldn't attach to them. If you're Samsung and you have a famous name and you make a better hoverboard, everybody buys the Samsung hoverboard. Somebody who made a better hoverboard here would possibly look like a more expensive version of another hoverboard. Okay? But then the final thing, this is the final clincher. Just before Christmas, when this was the kind of Christmas present du jour for Britain, was in 2000 and whatever it was, 14, okay? One or two of them, when charging, blew up or caught fire. I think in one case it set fire to the Christmas tree. Now, if it had been that if it had been that a particular brand of hoverboard had blown up, we all would have avoided that one and we would have bought a different one. Without the branding mechanism, we didn't know which one to avoid, so we avoided all of them, and the category died. And there's a whole area here of the market for lemons, this great piece by George Akerlof, okay? One of the things I've never understood is Akerlof was bright enough to win a Nobel Prize for the market for lemons, which every procurement person should read because it shows about the complexity of how markets operate under conditions of asymmetric information. Okay. But it never occurred to Akerlof, possibly because he's married to Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen's written some really anti-advertising economic papers. Okay. But it never occurred to him to realize the extent to which brands, particularly over time, are a solution to this problem of information asymmetry. Reputation should be a factor in a procurement decision. Sorry to say it, but it should be. Now, what role that should play, but I mean, the fact that someone's vulnerable to shame is a highly, highly relevant. It's why, for example, in a sense, what a brand is in a world where once perhaps your geographical location and your local customers provided trust, maybe the brand is a way of scaling up that trust so that it extends beyond the local. But I'm really intrigued by this because I think understanding the dynamics of trust and reputation, I think there's a Nobel Prize in economics to be won by someone who, a chap called Ben Pollock at Yale, who I think is the provost of Yale, he believes there's a Nobel Prize to be won in the field of reputational game theory. Okay. I think there's a whole area of investigation here about brands and reputation, which economists are only beginning to understand. And only dimly, and I genuinely think that it's patently a long-held evolutionary mechanism for keeping people honest, which is that reputational damage. There are many, many situations where the short-term best strategy is to cheat, and what makes someone honest in one of those sort of ultimatum games is the prospect of repetition. An investment in a reputation up front, particularly because the mathematics of reputation are odd, in that reputation kind of isn't additive, it's kind of multiplicative, in that you can do wonderful, wonderful things, and then you do one terrible thing, and your reputation is really, really hit.
Yeah.
And so that multiplicative nature of reputational investment is patently a really potent mechanism for keeping companies and people honest. Another one which I talk about is also market dynamics in the preservation of honesty. And there was, in most of history, I think bankers have been a bunch of crooks who've blown up the economy. And the reason I make that with confidence is that religion always has something to say about money lending, right? And the fact that religions that date back 2,000 years, 1,400 years, etc., are all obsessed with this business of money lending suggests that banking crises have been happening for a long time. Now, one way in which you had highly trustworthy banking is when you had a local branch network. And the local bank manager was embedded in the local community, often for 20 years. He belonged to the local golf club. He was probably a member of the local... You have various things, the Lions Club, the Rotarians, But what's really, really interesting is that there was another mechanism which kept the bank manager honest. Not only the fact that he was highly visible and subject to reputational shame, but the other thing is because he was local, all his customers knew each other. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a really important point, because if he had a bunch of customers dotted all over the world, it would be rational for him to take some innocent widow and double her home insurance premiums because she never noticed. Okay? If you do that as a local bank manager, you only need to be caught out once by one person, and your trust is gone with everybody because they're interconnected. So the interconnectedness of people is also a really, really interesting question in terms of the maintenance of trust. And so, no, I mean, this commoditization thing, I hate it for all sorts of reasons. I also hate it as a creative person, because the real opportunities to improve human experience, if you accept subjective value, and I'm a total Austrian on this one, okay, in terms of the School of Economics I adhere to, value is subjective and it's context dependent. There's not there isn't this kind of utility thing that economists believe. It's a much more complicated thing than that. And by defining in advance what value is, you prove, and by codifying it, and by therefore attempting to achieve accurate comparison, apples to apples comparison between your suppliers, you fail to allow for what you might call the wild card creative idea, which defies all your current metrics, but is actually much closer. In other words, with trains, okay, I've argued for a long time that putting Wi-Fi on trains is better than making trains faster. We've recently got Wi-Fi on southeastern trains in the UK. To be absolutely honest, when I arrive at my terminus destination, I'm usually slightly annoyed that the journey wasn't 3 minutes longer, because I draw into the station when I'm in the middle of sending an email.
Yeah, one more email to go still.
And I had to do the undignified business of carrying your laptop off the train in a silly way. Now, at some level, business innovation often takes place because someone actually redefines value in a really interesting way. Okay, the really innovative businesses are businesses which, in a very Austrian sense, say, actually, what's important about X isn't this, it's that. Sometimes there are businesses which are brilliantly reinvented around that, by the way, which is, until I watched a documentary recently, I didn't realize how brilliant the firm Cunard was, which had this thing. So throughout the 1920s and 30s, the whole thing about the transatlantic travel market was the blue ribbon. It was how fast a ship can cross the Atlantic. And they competed on this furiously. And then jet travel came along, and the blue ribbon became a monstrous irrelevance, because no one was ever going to build a ship which was even close to a Boeing, right? So what Cunard did, and their pioneering work in things like, they were the first people to have balcony cabins, for example, with private balconies. They said, essentially, we've got to redefine this journey completely, because speed is now a totally useless metric. The metrics we now deploy in deciding what makes a good transatlantic crossing have to be all about, luxury, opulence, nostalgia, emotion, okay? Just extraordinary civilization, the civilized nature of the journey, and so on. And so quite often a business can sell the same thing over the course of 20 or 30 years in a completely different way. Mm-hmm. The meaning of something. A wonderful example of Jeremy Bullmore's, by the way, is, when all cheese had a rind on it, someone charged a premium for rindless cheddar, and you paid a bit extra to get cheddar without the rind on it. And then you fast forward another 20 years, and actually you put the rind on, charge 20% more, and you call it artisan cheddar, okay?
Yeah.
But, the same thing can be both good or bad depending on the context. I'm always interested in, capitalism also is a continual battle to cope with the changing context of human decision making. So, airports have all got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. When we first went to an airport that was like a shopping centre, which was probably Schiphol or Changi or one of those, we thought, God, it's just unbelievable. It's amazing. It's like, oh God, they've got a this and they've got a that, and you can buy a so and so, And then eventually all airports became like that, and suddenly the small boutique airport suddenly had this resurgence. Okay, so London City Airport, it's brilliant. You can just turn up 12 minutes before. You're practically at the gates. You just go through security. You're out on the plane.
Yeah.
Now,
and you pay a premium for that. We have one locally
you pay a premium
here,
now.
LAX versus the local regional airport. Take me to the regional airport.
No, sir. I mean, if you go from there's one actually in LA. There are a few out there. There's John Wayne.
Yeah, there's Ontario
Airport. There's Ontario. Is there one in Orange County?
Yes, that is John Wayne. Yeah, Santa Ana.
That's John Wayne.
Yeah.
What's the one? Burbank as well is another one, isn't it? Just JetBlue, yeah. Now, you'd actually pay a premium to go from Burbank or something.
Yeah.
Now, in a way, 30 years ago, rather like that Cunard example, a small airport was just a shit airport, because all airports were shit, and this one is especially shit because it hasn't even got
it's got two gates and a bus to take you back to the building.
And the strangest thing is, no one would have experienced any excitement using Burbank or using London City Airport 25 years ago. But suddenly, because all airports have suffered this kind of elephantiasis, we're kind of punching the air when we come through, kind of childish excitement at the minimalism of the whole thing. And I mean, the whole of capitalism has just got to cope with that. There isn't really an optimal thing that's independent of its context or which isn't path dependent in some way.
So if we think about this kind of art of, and I think you placed in these terms in one of your TED Talks, like the art of placing material value on things that were previously discounted, and we think back to the procurement function as we're still trying to do a lot of work on increasing the perception of the role that we play as a team. If you had that brief at one of your clients, we need to increase the perception of the procurement team and assume that for all intents and purposes, that group was fit for purpose. So we're not selling something that doesn't necessarily exist. Where would you start?
I think the one thing is to have a the one way to start, okay, is let's look at the world's most successful companies, okay. Mm-hmm. None of them, although Apple's procurement, I'm sure, an interesting question, by the way, I'll raise, okay, which is just a vulnerability. I don't understand why Amazon treats its warehouse staff so brutally, okay? And I don't quite understand when the new consignment of Gorilla Glass arrived for the first iPhone, okay? It arrived at Foxconn at 2 o'clock in the morning, and immediately people went around basically waking the workforce up in their dormitories so they could start work immediately, okay? Now, if you're a procurement person whose only focus is one thing, okay, you would say that that's an optimal outcome. A holistic thinker would argue, look, actually, in the scheme of things, all we're saving is 0.3 cents per unit. It looks hugely, of course, when you're selling millions of units, 0.3 cent saving looks fantastic. Yeah. And, of course, justifies your salary for 5 years. Yeah. My only complaint is with Amazon's approach, say, is that, okay, labor costs in warehouses are a kind of rounding error for Amazon, right? Okay, obviously to the guy who's responsible for that, it's his bread and butter, and he's focused on that. The biggest, what you might call existential threat to Amazon is a consumer boycott. Okay, now, let's say you have a country which is particularly volatile, like Germany, where, they turned on Shell, I think completely unreasonably, but we'll park that later, okay. They had a complete sort of hissy fit with Shell a few years ago, and there was a massive boycott. You only need 2 or 3 people to die of heat stroke in a warehouse, okay. And a consumer boycott, now you've got a problem, Okay, you've got all those economies of scale, you've got that fantastic network effect, blah, blah, blah. It all means nothing without a consumer market. This is, by the way, why I love brands and hate commodities, okay? Brands are political accountability in commercial form. Okay, there's a dry cleaner in Sevenoaks. Okay, I've got 4 dry cleaners I can use. There's a dry cleaner in Sevenoaks. I once turned up at 2:05. The guy was still there, but he wouldn't allow me to collect my jacket because it was 5:02. I've never used him ever again.
Right. Yeah.
Now, my freedom to essentially punish and reward is essential to the workings of a decent market. And if you take away that consumer freedom to actually attach blame or credit to the original begetter of some product or service, and you commoditize things, you reduce consumer power, and therefore you reduce the extent to which markets are receptive and adaptable to and are forced to adapt to consumer preference. And by the way, however wacko that might be, I mean, I think some of the attempts at sort of politically motivated brand boycotts, let's say Chick-fil-A, I think they're unattractive in many respects, okay? But nonetheless, I reserve the right of a consumer to boycott any product or service for any reason they choose. It's a fundamental importance. And the way to remove that right is basically by removing the branding, which makes that consumer preference possible and therefore visible and therefore economically potent. So when you commoditize, when you make anything kind of formulaic, you basically remove that, along with removing all the emotional value from my Anglesey sea salt by saying it's sodium chloride. It's not, okay? Now, so I've just gone off on one. I'm getting so angry about commodities. I've completely lost my thread.
I triggered you again.
You triggered me. I'm so sorry. But I think so one really interesting question is, so I asked that question about, that very large companies seem to regard a sort of very nasty neoliberal approach to their workforce as a kind of badge of honor. I think that's to do with the attitude of stock market investors, not the attitude of consumers, by the way. I would argue that that's slightly dangerous. But nonetheless, the really interesting thing is that most of the really successful companies in the world with huge margins are things like Apple or their French luxury goods companies, which are not adopting, in a sense, I don't know how Louis Vuitton's procurement function works, okay? But what I'm saying is that the idea that somehow consumers reward companies for being extraordinarily efficient and mean-spirited seems to fly in the face of pretty much all economic experience. The other point is that you end up in a race to the bottom anyway. You end up, who wants to be a business which is defined so the other thing about logic, of course, and this is a really important point, is if you have a very narrow logical approach to a business, and there's always room in a marketplace for people who do that. I mean, there's always room for a Ryanair, okay? There's always room for a kind of travel lodge and Premier Inn. Although actually, I mean, I'm being unfair to those people because they're far from being, entirely utilitarian. But there's always room for a Ryanair in the market. You want to get there as low as possible, that's it, okay? If you want market diversity, however, and you also want interesting competition, you have to abandon that very instrumentalist view of what a business does, because otherwise you'll end up competing with the maddest person in the sector, and you don't want to end up doing that. And at some level, brand value remains, one way in which you can actually escape from that. But I think, one of the things you'll notice with EasyJet is basically the great success of EasyJet is that people will pay a premium for that over Ryanair because it just feels a little bit
it's
warmer.
Not Ryanair. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So that. And I think, by the way, the financial sector are hugely guilty of the Ryanairization of businesses because they have an extraordinarily poor understanding of intangible value. But I think there's a wider problem. I think there's a wider philosophical problem, which is that the educational system politics, business prizes a very particular kind of thinking mode, which is what you might call sort of systemic thinking. Okay, it's reduce something to a mathematical or engineering style model, solve for that model, reimpose on reality. And the problem I have with this, apart from anything else, is that there are now, I mean, if there were logical answers to the problem, someone would have solved it. The problems that remain, the problems that are actually persistent in modern political life or in modern business life, are probably logic proof. I have this very interesting kind of joke, which is sort of a joke, which is, if you want everything in your kitchen to be dishwasher proof, just treat everything in your kitchen as if it's dishwasher proof, and 2 years later, everything that survives will be. It's kind of a Darwinian approach to your dishwasher. And in the same way, most business problems don't suffer from underexposure to McKinsey or consultants or economists or rationalists, okay? So generally, the problems that rationality and a kind of first-order common sense can solve, they've already been solved. So the problems that remain, it's a bit like antibiotic resistance. What remains after you've overdosed rationality on everything is those problems which have evolved or developed or have always had a kind of resistance to rational solution. And so I think the whole world, and procurement is equally part of this, is oversupplied with systemic thinking. And I think holistic thinking, perverse creative thinking, complex systems thinking, I'm a big fan of that. I think other modes of thinking, and actually, by the way, just sheer randomness. I literally mean that. Occasionally, maybe the best thing to do is just to say, okay, this seems sensible. Everybody else is doing this, so we're going to do something else. That great scene in Airplane, should we turn on the runway lights? That's exactly what they'll be expecting us to do. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is it's obviously silly in context, but the man making that statement is a military guy. I think he's called Kramer, if I'm right. And in military strategy, of course, you can't be rational. It would have been awful. Okay, we couldn't have done the D-Day landings if they'd been controlled by procurement, because they would have insisted that we cross the channel from between Dover and Calais to minimize on transportations and logistical costs. But that's what the Germans expected us to do. Okay, so there's a value in actually abandoning procurement thinking completely occasionally, simply because everybody else has adopted it. So the D-Day landings, military strategy, there's patently a role for military procurement. My wife used to work in it, okay? But if you had military decisions controlled by people whose principal motivation was cost reduction, most successful military activity relies on creative extravagance, basically. It's actually in burning resources in an unexpected way. Because the cheapest solution is the one that everybody's already got a defense against, because that's what they're expecting.
Right. So I have one question about innovation. And you talked about, doing things different, doing things the way that not expected. And that's something we actually, as a function, are definitely trying to kind of change our path a little bit to how do we embrace innovation? How do we bring innovation from outside our organizations to a way that, helps challenge and catalyze the thinking within our businesses of doing something different, challenging a status quo. And we're often stuck by process in doing that.
By the way, procurement has this potential, I think, to be magical, which is that if, first of all, stop trying to be fair, because when you try and be fair, you make everybody uniform, and people game the system eventually. And it also creates homogenization in suppliers. So stop trying to be fair, genuinely, okay? That's terrible, but I kind of mean that. Secondly, the other thing is, I know that there's a beautiful fairness in saying that the past doesn't matter. So that, in other words, okay, so this is what's happening in the advertising industry. Okay, you serve on a bit of business for 3 years, and then after your 3 years is up, you repitch for the business, the decision's made on cost, and your past performance is irrelevant, okay? Now, that seems like a wonderfully fair process. Let me explain how an ad agency works. to be honest, okay, most of the value generated by an ad agency is by the agency doing things that it wasn't asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
Right now, I think that's now. Why would an agency do something it wasn't asked to do? The reason is it would do so as an investment in a relationship, in an investment in social capital.
Yeah.
So the old-fashioned way advertising worked is you got 15% commission, which was far too much. Okay, legally you had to receive this 15% commission. So in order to justify yourself to your client, you gave clients a lot of added value services to make up for the fact that you were making this absurd amount of money. Okay.
Right.
Now, actually, you could do some really clever things there. So a good agency could say, okay, we'll pay £70,000 for some research on press advertising, which is worth £30,000 to all of our 10 clients. Mm-hmm. So we'll spend X thousand pounds, and the net value of this to all 10 clients is £300,000.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay. Now, if you tried to get each company to pay for that individually, now, the reason you do all that, if it's worse, it would just generate into golf days and corporate entertainment. And I'm always conscious of the fact that although those things have a emotional value, they can run out of control. Mm-hmm. Okay, but a good ad agency would actually justify its existence in lots of discretionary ways by adding value in ways that weren't expected. Now, the second you say that your past doesn't affect your future, you're basically destroying any incentive for an agency to invest in a relationship. And as I put it very bluntly, there's no point in doing a favor for an amnesiac. Okay?
Yeah.
Right? You know, don't help an amnesiac move house, because the next time you say, well, I'm moving house, could you help me? They'll go, well, you've never helped me move house. Right? Now, social capital is dependent on the shadow of the future. And if you effectively say this relationship is reset to zero, like Pol Pot or, you know, the Cambodian style, we reset the relationship to year zero every 3 years, then the incentive of an agency becomes extractive rather than creative. And understanding the value of undefinable. Now, this happened. If you talk to John Kay, the FT journalist, he claims that Marks and Spencer did this in the UK. They had this extraordinary social capital because they'd been very, very loyal to suppliers. When they made a fortune when they suddenly abandoned their existing, typically British suppliers mm-hmm. and started sourcing clothes overseas. Yeah. What they lost, however, is what they didn't realize is, based on the longevity of the relationship, a lot of their suppliers were conducting huge amounts of R&D, and when they had a great idea, they took it to M&S first. Right. And in John Kay's phrase, when they started effectively buying purely on price, not on holistic value, they destroyed millions and millions of pounds worth of social capital, more or less in a week. And social capital matters. It's just hard to measure, that's all.
Yeah, and that's something we struggle with. We have, within the profession of procurement, there's a branch of supplier relationship management. I say a branch, it should be integrated in everything we do, but it's taking that long form view of a relationship with a supplier. So you're working on problems, challenges, you're not just working on cost. The difficulty that we have, and I think this is that's something we always need to keep at the forefront of our mind, is when times get tough, it's really easy to go back on everything we've talked about in terms of developing a long-term relationship, being a customer or a client of choice, and we go back to, okay, what's the best way we can reduce cost? And the moment you do that, then the relationship is just broken, because then they can't trust you the next time you show that you want to have all these good intentions again because the business cycle changed. And it's something we really struggle with. And I think it comes down to incentives a lot of the time.
And there are cultural, I think the Japanese behave very differently in this way, don't they? Obviously, yeah. They will essentially, and actually some interesting British companies, Tesco, there are certain organizations which have certain suppliers to whom they're very, very loyal. Yeah. And the reciprocation of that is kind of worth it. Now, when actually your loyalty isn't repaid, that's the real time to break things off. But there is patently a price to be paid for getting what you might call discretionary but incremental value out of businesses, particularly in advertising, where the value of the business. First of all, I can't even mathematically define a good ad or a bad ad. Okay, that's an entirely subjective question. But it goes much further than that. So, a retail client of ours, one of the things I've obsessed about for ages, which I've now discovered someone has adopted, is lots of people go into shops and they intend to buy three things, and then they don't pick up a basket, and then they go around the shop and they end up dropping things because they're trying to carry them cradled in their arms. And my suggestion is put shopping baskets in the middle of shops, not just at the entrance, for people who've changed their mind. Okay, now, actually, I'm not suggesting that to work of genius, but to a large retailer, it's probably worth a few million quid. Okay. Now, if my engagement with that client is sufficient that you deliver 4 or 5 of those things unasked for, and by the way, they're unasked for in many cases because they're solutions to problems that are unseen. So that's one of the most important. We have a phrase in Ogilvy Change, which is unseen opportunities. And one of the problems that we've spotted is that the real problems that behavioral science can often solve in organizations aren't even realized to be problems. So no one's ever going to come and say, so the way we have to engage with the client is, look, we'll look in your business in a holistic way, and we'll spot ways in which things can be improved. But the idea that, in many cases, that we actually uncover problems that nobody ever noticed. And so I think there's a real danger in terms of how procurement's incentivized, because incentives, Richard Thaler, who's in many ways the godfather of behavioral science, runs a business. And he said to me that in his business, the bonuses they pay are subjectively determined. Because the business of making bonuses based on objective measures is mostly catastrophic. It creates gaming of the system, behavioral distortion, in many cases, completely perverse unintended consequences. At some level, if you incentivize people on cost savings, you're basically bribing people to destroy social capital. If you paid me, if you employed me and I was paid a salary to ring up all my suppliers and insult them, okay, that's more or less what you could be doing if you actually reward buyers purely on price saving. If you had a procurement function with the power, in other words, this is all about how the procurement function is incentivized, really. And there needs to be what you might call a facility for measuring the upside benefit of spending more alongside the benefit of spending less. Yeah. And when it's done well, and if it were incentivized well, it could be a truly magical influence on business.
As we struggle with that internally of how we change our incentive structure, and I want to just tie into kind of the change element of the work that you do. Is there a well-trodden path on how to start changing in those who measure our performance, how they see the value that we can bring, and then change the incentive structure to support that?
The whole design of incentives thing is really, really interesting, because one of the things that's happened, and this is again a product of neoliberal economics, is that all incentives within businesses are paid conditionally. Mm-hmm. Now, I've long argued very unfashionably that there was a value to those company perks of the 1980s, like the company car or the slightly gratuitously extravagant training course in Kitzbühel. Okay, the value to those things was that they signaled to the employee that you were investing in them. Okay, it was upfront expense which said reliably to the employee, my company values me and sees me as part of its future. Current bonuses tend to be conditional. If you do this, I will pay you that. Now, that has a value in changing behavior, but it doesn't have any kind of signaling value in terms of signaling what you might call repetition probability. In other words, continuation probability signaling. It doesn't actually say to the employee, you are now a trusted member of our team and we've invested in you. So there's a whole load of psychology around the very simplest area of incentive just before we even get started. And then there's the thing of, saving money through creativity deserves a far higher bonus than saving money through what you might call just grinding out incremental, painful cost savings. Yeah. Okay. But then there's a third question, which I have to ask, and I think Nassim Taleb, if you were on the podcast, would ask the same thing, which is, what about skin in the game? Mm-hmm. Because if you can claim the gains from a saving, as with perhaps, you come up with some wonderful single hub logistics solution, okay, but you don't suffer the costs of failure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And similarly, the other problem, which I blame a lot of management consultant firms for, is visible savings, hidden costs. And so, as I said, that business of so at some level, there needs to be a policing of the procurement function, which is nuanced and subjective. Because until someone comes up with a social capital metric, I don't quite know how the system's going to work. But you can end up with a strategy which I think in the investment community is called picking up pennies in front of a steamroller. And the idea of that is you do lots and lots and lots of savings, and the reason you're making those savings is each one comes with a remote chance of total catastrophe. And so, some better measure of value. The other one is, of course, it's a totally one-way street. My argument would be that most of business has become a cost-saving, a kind of masturbatory cost-saving competition to an alarming extent. If you look at the way, again, this is Jules Goddard at the London Business School, the typical balance sheet has one line for revenue and about 6 lines for cost. And generally a board meeting will focus its attention on those things in exactly the same ratio. 6 times as much attention will be paid to cost as will be paid to how to get the revenue line trending upwards. The burden of proof required of someone who suggests something which is basically in line with neoliberal economics is very, very low. On a very simple level, okay, if you said product X isn't selling, so we're going to drop the cost, that will be waved through a board meeting on the knob. Now, quite often, actually, more often than you'd think, you can increase the sales of things by putting the price up. Now, you're going to go, that's crazy, aren't you? You're going to say, that's ridiculous, right? This man is mad. Get him off this podcast immediately. Let me give you a theoretical example, okay? You've got 2 products, product A and product B. Product B has more features and higher functionality than product A. And product B costs less than product A, right? Now, to an economist, that's the easiest decision in the world. It's a total slam dunk, okay, higher utility, lower cost, ka-ching, right? Yep. Humans have evolved a second-order social intelligence, which asks the question, hold on, if that product really were better, they'd charge more for it, right? I don't get that. Why is this thing, why does it have more functions? Nestle at the moment are doing a completely bizarre thing. I'm so sorry about this.
No problem.
Where they have 2 coffee machines, the Virtuo and the Virtuo Plus, which is an automatic version, and the Virtuo Plus is charged at the same price as the Virtuo. Now, I'd be happy to buy either of them, but I can't make sense of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, my evolved brain is going, does not compute, cannot compare, and I effectively end up sort of walking into walls in bemusement. Now, so actually, in the case of the person who has a product with more functionality but lower cost, what tends to happen in that condition is the consumer doesn't buy either of them because they can't make sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
All right? Funny enough, I think it happens, you can witness this. I'm fairly sure there's data from yield management where, don't get me on yield management, by the way. I love yield management because it's fantastic and I think it creates huge economic value if done well, but it's mostly done badly. But more of that later, maybe. But what's really interesting there is that actually putting the price up would actually enable you to sell far more. So with yield management, I think there's some evidence that occasionally yield management software would produce a first-class rail ticket for less than the price of a second-class rail ticket. Yeah. Now, again, you'd think it's a really easy... What actually happens is the consumer goes, no, that's weird, that's a mistake, I don't know what's going on, doesn't make sense. so they actually buy the second-class ticket.
Because they think that's a guarantee of a ticket versus somebody coming back and
they kind of go, there's I guess humans have, not ridiculously, a kind of too good to be true heuristic.
Yeah.
A perfect example of that is, you're all procurement people, but if I suddenly came outside your house one day and offered you a brand new BMW 7 Series for $8,000, you wouldn't buy it.
No, you
your
wonder
first
what strings
reaction
are
quite
attached.
reasonably would be, there's something wrong here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rory. I really appreciate the time that you've invested in it and spending on the line and the insights that you've given. Like you say, it's just the start, I think, for us to start thinking about these concepts, but it's a lot of food for thought.
Thanks ever so much. It's been fantastic. Again, anytime I'm really happy to discuss this, but we haven't come up with an answer. I think what we have done is come up with a list of some really interesting problems, which will require really creative, and in many cases, I think, solutions which would at first glance seem deeply illogical to the people in the function.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all about changing your mindset and thinking kind of outside the realms of perhaps your previously, I don't want to say blinkered thinking, because it's not blinkered. It's just the way that we're kind of taught and educated to think.
I think systemic thinkers have an inbuilt flaw, and I can end on this note because it's almost perfect. The inbuilt flaw in our education system actually probably exacerbates this, where systemic thinkers are totally happy to sacrifice context for a sense of certainty. So the way they achieve their glorious lack of ambiguity, and a lack of ambiguity in business is always a very comforting thing to have, okay, is by actually ignoring wider context. And we've got to somehow correct for this. And I'm very happy if anybody wants to contact me on Twitter, at Rory Sutherland. I'm very, very happy to act as a kind of agony aunt to confused or upset procurement staff who've been distressed by the contents of this podcast.
All right. Well, anyone listening who wants to do that, please be nice. All right,
thanks. Be rude, actually. I'm totally happy about that.
All right. Well, Rory, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.